Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As part of the Mediation Symposium 2022, we bring you the sixth in the series of Commercial Stability in a World of Conflict, co-hosted by JAMS and the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event. In episode 1 of this series, in April, I mentioned two different worlds that I've inhabited alternately during my career. That of mediation practice in international intervention and development, dominated by interdisciplinarity and known as conflict resolution, and mediation practice in the civil commercial environment, intimately connected with the legal profession and dominated by legal discourse, and known as alternative dispute resolution. Many on each side of this divide are unfamiliar with the other side's literature and discourse. And this sixth episode, Mediation, Fragile Settlement, or Transformational Development, draws on an accusation sometimes levelled at ADR by conflict resolution, and that is that ADR is obsessed with settlement and ignores deeper issues, questions, and opportunities to address underlying interests and needs. For those who've mediated in the commercial context, the clarity that the parties' wishes are paramount mean the answer is simply the parties want swift settlement, and the major part of this is usually facilitating a distributive negotiation process. However, most also vehemently maintain that we're not simply messengers. We work with the legal, the personal, and the commercial, and we challenge, we reality test in a more or less facilitative way, depending on our style. So do we as mediators recognize, and do we have the skills to navigate exploration and reality testing when long-term issues such as whether agreements are going to fall foul in relation to sustainability and principles or practices of sustainable development are on the table? And if there's always a trade-off between cost, speed, and quality in terms of outcomes, what do different areas of mediation practice have to learn from each other in how to help parties navigate the balance between getting settlement and achieving sustainable outcomes when the two things don't always coincide? My name is Isabel Phillips. I'm Director of ADR and Mediation Development at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and I'm co-moderator of this webinar together with Nikki Borowski of JAMS, who I'll introduce shortly. The format of this session will be 1 hour and 15 minutes long. We might nick a few more minutes at the end, but let's see how we go. After this short introduction, there'll be thoughts from our three speakers, then discussion and Q&A. So please do add questions and of course, any technical issues, the chat is there and there'll be people to help you. So now on to introductions. First, Mohammed Raja is a former associate professor at the University of South Africa's Graduate School of Business Leadership and a CEDA accredited mediator. From 1980 to 2016, he lectured in labor law, conflict management, industrial relations, and dispute resolution. So he's worked for more than 30 years in mediation and arbitration within that arena. And he's now a part-time academic and a full-time ADR practitioner. So by my maths, that makes definitely more than 100% working time, which is why he's currently on a webinar at 11 o'clock at night at his time. So thank you for being with us, Mohammed.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Next, we have Jimena Bustamante, who is founding partner of Pactum Dispute Resolution Consulting, a full-time mediator with experience in over 1,000 cases, including highly complex disputes and controversies with the public sector, both in Ecuador and abroad. She was ranked as one of the top 3 mediators in Ecuador by the Leaders League in 2021 and 2022, and is also on the UN mediation roster. Finally, Hiro Aragaki is a Chartered Institute, an active dual-qualified international arbitrator and mediator at JAMS. And when I say dual-qualified, I'm referring to the US and the UK specifically. He is also a tenured professor of law and director of the Center for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law in San Francisco, as well as a professorial research associate at SOAS School of Law in London. Finally, Nikki Borowski, I've mentioned already, my co-moderator, Senior Global Practice Manager at JAMS Local Solutions, She is an attorney, mediator, and promoter of creative, thoughtful dispute resolution processes. Prior to her role as Senior Global Practice Manager at JAMS, she was a Vice President at the CPR Institute. She's worked in-house at Alstom as well as in the international arbitration practices at Latham & Watkins and Proskauer in Paris, France. So welcome to all of you, and over to you, Nikki.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you again for this opportunity to collaborate with Ciarb. This is the 6th installment in a vision that my former colleague Rance Howell put into motion months ago now, and we're ready to delve into questions of how mediation can help and whether it is a fragile settlement or a transformational development opportunity. I just want to give a little bit of background and context to how this series came about. And it really was JAMS seeing the way the world was changing, the conflicts arising, and anticipating the client's needs for innovative dispute resolution and options that we wanted to put on the table for disputes that we saw. So this is all part of a campaign of listening, tailoring, adapting, and training to the purposes and problems that are on the horizon. The framework that we're working with, a very brief overview, is really the purpose of this 6-part series, and we keep on adding parts just because the conversation has been so robust, is really to bring together a diverse variety of voices to engage in a timely conversation about the overlap of conflict resolution and dispute resolution. As Isabel was saying, there are worlds which sometimes are doing the same sorts of things, but very infrequently collide and collaborate and share. The disputes and the conflict that we're experiencing, I don't need to belabor. We all have seen on the daily news and in our emails and amongst our friends and colleagues and at work, the kinds of challenges that are facing the world right now. War, climate change, global warming, supply web disruption, conflicts that are arising in contracts, and increased business risk, all combining with social, economic, environmental, and governance challenges. I wanted to just highlight for all of you that are joining us just today, the full robust extent of the 5 previous sessions that we've had. They've all been recorded by Ciarb and are available on YouTube free of charge to watch and to engage with and listen to. And I highly recommend engaging with this conversation if you have time. The overall picture has been 5 webinars, 11 guest speakers with their own perspectives, and thousands of virtual audience members who've been engaging and questioning and asking dangerous and interesting and challenging prompts for everybody to speak to. The purpose of today's session is really to offer you some practical tips for sustainable mediation. What do we mean by sustainability? Our speakers will speak to that. They may have different answers. They'll be challenging each other. They'll be challenging you. And we hope that you will challenge all of us as we navigate the challenges and see how mediation might lend itself to sustainability and addressing some of these issues. We're also building on the dialogue that happened on Tuesday, the first day of the Chartered Institute's Mediation Symposium. How can the flexibility of mediation help to address these challenges? I would like to replace alternative, maybe with adequate for ADR, for dispute resolution that can really adapt to urgent crises, the kinds that we're seeing more and more. And I think that we'll also touch upon points that Georgina and Andrew, 2 of the speakers for Tuesday's sessions, highlighted about the need to speak broadly and reach new audiences, and also addressing how mediation really does address a solution where not just one party can win, and that will support and underscore sustainability matters. So in closing, before we get to the real reason why you're here, I just want to say that it's a great opportunity to listen, acknowledge, learn, respond, and engage with you in this conversation. And that really is another prompt for you to pop your questions into the chat and follow up as best you can. Thank you so much. And now I'm handing it back to Isabel for the real discussion to begin.
Thank you, Nikki. So we're going to start off with some impulses from each of our speakers in turn, and then we'll get into discussions. So I'd like to hand the mic, first of all, to Mohammed, if you would pick it up and run with it. Though if you give it back at the end, then we'll be able to hear the others too. So.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. When I saw the title firstly, and when I was asked to come on, sort of, the fragile settlement or transformational development, and I thought of that, and the first thing that came to mind is ongoing relationship, but also the triple constraints theory that you mentioned, and then I thought, are the two mutually exclusive? Can you not have both? And obviously that's what mediators, we need to realize that you can have a settlement and it doesn't have to be a fragile settlement. It could be a good settlement and have the transformational development. And there's examples in political and labor disputes, in family disputes, family business disputes. And South Africa obviously is one of the places where we've shown this in transformation. And there are other studies as well. And I know that project managers grapple with, obviously, the triple constraints theory. And in that case, perhaps you can't have all three. Perhaps you can have two, or have all three, but to a lesser or greater extent. But as mediators, we know that at times, depending on the issues and the nature of the dispute, that settlement is almost the most important part of the mediation for some parties. They wanted to get it over with, the relationship is not important. In that case, obviously, that's fine. However, in family, employment, business, partnership, and more so political conflicts and disputes, transformation and the ongoing relationship are important. So I'd like to point a broad picture of mediation in South Africa to aid this discussion. We have the Center for Constructive Resolution of Disputes, ACCORD, a civil society organization. They work all over Africa to bring about creative African solutions to the challenges arising from conflicts. They've identified mediation considerations such as prioritizing issues, inclusivity, stakeholder dynamics, leadership and ownership, and these are important elements and inputs for the mediation. And it's important for securing negotiated agreements and in shaping longer-term societal consideration. The South African experience has demonstrated that mediation efforts are important, conflict transformation is possible. Clearly, it's not an instant occurrence, and as mediators, we know that. It's a start. It starts a process for the parties. It starts transformation. It maps out or the route. It paves the way for the parties to continue. In my own mediation practice, in dealing mainly with labor disputes, I do some commercial, some social, some community, but in my own mediation practice, which is mainly labor, I'm guided by the South African labor law, which prescribes, and it mentions conciliation, which we, of course, is mediation for us, as the compulsory first stage of dispute resolution. The South African Labor Relations Act of 1995 has as its main purpose to advance economic development, social justice, labor peace, and the democratization of the workplace, in other words, transformation. So that for me, in a nutshell, it was. And in our political arena as well, we've had transformation as a result of mediation. I know you said at the beginning we have a little, so I'll stop there. Further, we can deal with in question time or discussion time. And obviously, there's quite a lot more I can say.
I'm sure there is. Thank you, Mohammed. A really interesting starting point. I'm going to hand straight over on that note to Jimena.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you so much to the Chartered Institute of Arbitration and to JAMS for hosting this and for thinking about this and for making us think about this, because I you know, as a mediator, you're not usually seeing the big picture, but just inside a case, in the specific case where you are trying to find an opportunity for parties to find settlement, to reach a final decision, to go home in peace, and you're not actually imagining what are the impacts for this kind of work that we do, and what is really our responsibility, and how can we actually help reach this goal of sustainability and sustainable development. So one of the questions that I was asked, and something that I really want to take a hold of, also listening to prior series of this webinar, it's this mediation with the government or with a government agency for which Ecuador has a lot of experience. And thankfully, Ecuador has a lot of experience, which allows me to talk to you about this today. But we do mediation regularly with either national or foreign investors, helping people reach solutions and resolutions that have impact in the whole country and have impact for the future of that relationship and for the future of the people that are the beneficiaries of whatever work was there. So we have issues as investor state, and as you know, the investor state system in itself seeks to provide investor with appropriate protections. At the time, it ensures the flow of foreign direct investment into countries as Ecuador. So mediation comes in a way as an important aid into that objective. But we also have mediations in public procurement cases, or even reparation of human rights with people that have been, it has been already sentenced that their human rights have been violated, or they are in the course of the international human rights courts, and we try to provide them with an adequate space to deal with their issues and have the government be liable, but also accept the responsibility that they've had, if they had any. And then now, and this is very new, we are starting with tax mediation, which was something that was not heard of before. So all these kind of cases that are not normal in civil law countries, I do think are important to promote the sustainable development. On one, I already mentioned, they keep the relationship of the parties, as Mohammed said, more often than not, is that parties reach an agreement because the private entity wants to continue doing business with the country, and they need to find a way to settle whatever it is that is being a rock in the road that doesn't let them continue. So they find a way to settle and continue on with the relationship. The other thing that they do is we ensure or try to ensure the termination of the infrastructure project when this is the question at hand. And that allows for the community to actually have that infrastructure project, although I think that maybe mediation comes a little bit late, and we should start thinking about dispute boards as a better way to ensure this termination of infrastructure projects. The other thing that we do with mediation is that we ensure the work with formal investors that comply with regulations and environmental and tax regulations and other regulations, because if we don't do this, we don't have a good relationship with the government and the investor, private investor, either national or foreign, you get all of these informal people that are taking advantage of whatever they have, like in mining, for instance, not complying with environmental regulations. So this is also a way to ensure sustainability. And finally, we are helping through mediation to develop conflict resolution skills within public entities, which has allowed them to settle the future disputes. So I have a case that if I have a second, I can tell you, we had this long mediation with a telecommunication company about interconnection, an issue that had been going on for 10 years. And it had already, a part of it was in arbitration, another part of it was in an administrative procedure, and another part of it was in a judicial procedure. So we started the negotiation, and part of the mediation meant having and developing teams within the public entity. Finally, we reached a settlement. But after the settlement, this entity came back to mediation, then they settled 3 more cases very fast because they were already prepared and they could do this. And it was easier for them, and they knew the ways and how to reach those agreements. So the next conflict is also, I think, part of thinking about sustainability and how to reach this goal of peace that we are actually working for. Thank you so much, Isabel. Back to you.
Thank you, Jimena. Really, really interesting. And I'm itching to ask questions, but I'm going to be very restrained and move on as it should be to Hiro, who I'm also eager to hand the mic to.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you to Ciarb and JAMS for inviting me to participate, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to throw out a couple of questions maybe and thoughts, responding a little bit to what I've heard so far. So I'm really taken by this distinction that's been drawn between fragile settlement and transformative development. I'd like to kind of mine that a little bit more. We talked a little bit about relationship and that being more on the kind of transformational side than the fragile side. And, one thing I just want to underscore is the fact that, just because parties don't agree to preserve their longstanding relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean that the settlement was fragile. So if you think about a dispute, say, between 2 businesses that have been doing business for a long time and have had a lengthy relationship, and they go to mediation, and the mediation is just all about money and severing that relationship and not preserving it, is a money-only settlement more fragile somehow than a settlement that would result in, entering into a new joint venture, perhaps? And I think that's a real question that, we need to think about, right? Because sometimes real transformation happens because parties do sever their relationship, because they buy each other out, because they move on. And by contrast, sometimes staying in that relationship is a form of fragile settlement, because sometimes parties are afraid of change, or because they're not willing to invest the effort that it really takes to find something that works better. So the mere fact that a relationship is preserved is not necessarily, to me, an indication that there's been something more transformative versus something that is fragile. We all know about unworkable relationships that really are worse than the alternative of just cutting things off. The other question that I would like to raise really is, we seem to be speaking about fragile settlements as if they're a bad thing. But I think in reality, the question is not whether they're bad in the abstract, but really bad compared to what? So compared to something like transformational development, fragile settlement doesn't sound all that appealing. But what about compared to no settlement, right? So in my experience, it's often hard enough reaching a fragile settlement at all. Isabel was talking about reality testing and pushing the parties and so on. And I find in my mediations that I am pulling out every trick I have, just to get them to finally meet at a number. And so to me, I guess I would suggest that maybe the real choice is often between fragile settlement and no settlement, right? And I think that most of us would prefer a fragile settlement to a much less sustainable option, namely litigation. And let's not forget that litigation really is the unsustainable choice here, right? It's impractical, it's wasteful, it's unnecessary for every dispute to go all the way to a full hearing on the merits. And this applies both to litigation and arbitration. By contrast, mediation can be accomplished in a fraction of the time, at a fraction of the cost. It's more accessible to the ordinary disputant, and so improves access to justice and also allows us to scale up dispute resolution. It can result in global settlements and not just the settlement of narrow legal claims. It can also result in creative and more satisfying solutions that no court could ever possibly award. So every one of us that contributes somehow to this endeavor of mediation, either by advising our clients to try mediation, teaching the next generation of students about conflict resolution, or even just by acting as a mediator, all of us are already doing our part in promoting sustainability within the dispute resolution ecosystem. And I think this is a really important point just not to lose sight of, right? Mediation really is the sustainable dispute resolution option, which is why the world can no longer really afford to ignore mediation anymore.
Thank you. A very, very persuasive case there, made very eloquently, I think. Something that I think it would be a nice point to pick up with. I think it does highlight one of the things that certainly in my experience of the commercial world, that getting a settlement and being able to let go of litigation puts people on a very different footing, because exactly that because of what the other options are, which is going forward into a litigative process. I think you put that case so eloquently. I'd quite like to go back to Jimena and Mohammed in terms of the two different contexts that you're in, and just get some thoughts around that point.
Thank you, Isabel. If I can, I absolutely agree with Hiro in what he is mentioning. Really, when you have parties in a mediation, you are in between no settlement and litigation and fragile settlement, which really we're talking about money settlement, and money comes from one side to the other, and that's already very hard. Then I think the next question is, what if you see an opportunity to promote a new business relationship, if there is a chance? I don't think that every case is good for that. I think that we should be realistic and adapt to whatever it is that the parties need and try to help them reach whatever it is that they need. But if there is a chance, if we spot that piece of light, are we responsible for following that opportunity? Should we promote it? Should we mention it? How do we deal with that? And then that's, I guess, the next question into what Hiro was mentioning that I would like to send back to him.
Mohammed.
Okay, if I can really, and I agree with you, Isabel, really persuasive. And as I was listening to you, and I thought, well, yes, I mean, maybe we should just let Hiro go on and do the whole sort of hour fast, or as long as we have, because it really sounds persuasive. But I've also thought, but maybe sometimes no settlement is better than a fragile settlement. Because you've clarified the issues for the parties. They then from there can plot ahead where they want to, and that perhaps the no settlement can start the transformation for the parties. Maybe separately, maybe they're not meant to be together, and the no settlement clarifies that for them, so they can go separate ways. And that comes up sometimes in the mediation. And I know we're so tied to, as a mediator, we must settle, because that's why we are there. The parties want us to settle. But over the years, I started realizing that maybe a no settlement is better for the parties. I know in the minority of cases, perhaps, but sometimes that may just be what it should be.
Yeah, if I could just chime in. So I think Mohammed is making a very important point, and I think it underscores the fact that, you know, it's difficult to say that there is one answer to this question. I think it really depends on the context, right? So I'm primarily in the commercial mediation sphere, where people are paying me a lot of money to mediate their cases, and as much as I, subscribe to the ideal that the goal of mediation should not be to settle, because if you're better off going to court, then you should do that. But the reality is that most of the time you're not better off going to court. But my role is not to kind of force you to settle at all costs. My role is to really interrogate the situation with you and do a risk analysis and help you figure out whether settling actually is in your best interest. And, there is this whole line of thought about transformative mediation. And those of us who read the book, The Promise of Mediation by Folger and Bush, know that in transformative mediation, the purpose is really not to problem solve. The purpose is not to try and settle. And that, as Mohammed mentioned, sometimes it's better not to settle because the real goal is transformation. And sometimes transformation only comes because there was no agreement or settlement. And so I think the answer to Isabel's question will probably be very context dependent. I think from my own point of view, so I wear a number of different hats, right? So I'm a commercial mediator. And, I think as a commercial mediator, so as I said before, I think I'm already doing my part with sustainability because I'm helping parties to mediate rather than litigate, right? So let's take the pressure off us a little bit, right? Because just by being associated with the field of mediation, I think we're doing a lot in terms of sustainability, and let's not forget that. But as a commercial mediator, I think, what else can I do to advance, sustainability besides perhaps, recommending that we have a Zoom mediation versus fly in from various destinations or submit everything electronically rather than in paper bundles. I don't know that there's a whole lot more that I can do, and we can talk about some examples of how this plays out in commercial mediation. I do also want to kind of signal that there are whole lots of other ways to be involved in the mediation field. So many of us in the audience, and in fact, many of the most influential people in the mediation field are not necessarily neutrals, right? They're educators, they're reformers, they're policymakers in the mediation space. And I think there's a whole other conversation here about how to promote sustainability in these other contexts where we're not necessarily acting as the neutral, but we may be doing other things that help promote this very sustainable practice of mediation.
Yeah.
I wondered if I could pick up on some of these thoughts from Jimena and Nikki also, because Nikki, you were talking about sort of whether the mediator can play a role in kind of modeling good conflict resolution behaviors and whether that can kind of rub off on the parties for the future and so on. And, Jimena, what you said that spoke to me was, you're pointing to this kind of disconnect on some level between the ideal and the real in mediation. Right. And I think this is something that we as trainers of mediation, and I have some more to say about training, but, we typically train in a very interest-based and idealistic and maybe even transformative kind of way, trying to promote mutual understanding and so on. But the harsh reality in many cases is that that's really not even where the parties want to be at, right? I think many of us as conflict resolvers, we have this inner fantasy, right, of being able to produce some deep healing between the parties, or maybe some kind of emotional catharsis that leads them to evolve somehow into better human beings. And I want to give you an example of mediations kind of similar to, I think, the case that Mohammed was just mentioning. So I mediated once a 20-year-old dispute between 3 generations of family business. And there were multiple, cousins and siblings and step-parents involved. And during one caucus, a very emotional family member explained to me that the root cause of this business dispute among all the family members was a long-standing conflict between her mother and another family member, which she thought that the younger generation, they were just oblivious to, they had no idea. And that this really was the real reason for all the bitterness and the misunderstanding between the parties. So, of course, in pursuit of this ideal of deep healing, I suggested that I facilitate a conversation between this person and her younger relative so she could explain some of this background. And, as emotional as she was also very adamant that she didn't want to do this. because she felt that that truth would be too painful for her relatives to hear. And she felt that that would really just tear the family apart. And so she was very clear to me that rather than work through that conflict, she preferred for the family business, which had been around for generations, to be divided up for monetary settlements. And of course, as a mediator, that's an unsatisfying, conclusion to the mediation in a way. But I think that we as mediators also have to take the parties as we find them, right? And also have some respect for this value of party self-determination. So if they want to keep it at the more quote unquote superficial level of money, on some level, the question is, who are we to push them in a different direction because of our own conceptions about, what might be good for sustainability or transformation?
I think it's an incredibly important point, not just the question of outcome neutrality, but what people leaving the autonomy and respecting autonomy rather than our own decisions about what should or shouldn't be involved in that in their disputes. And I want to pick up the point in a minute about the issues around things like training and that element of things. But before we move on to that, I'd just like to pick up within the boundaries of outcome neutrality and trust in the parties. I was looking at the Sustainability Development Goals, and it's quite an interesting read. I would recommend it also to our audience, because it might sound like just something over there that isn't really relevant to me, particularly maybe if you're in high income context. But so many of the things that are mentioned in there are fundamentally sort of headlines around the sort of disputes that we deal with. So ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns, building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, fostering innovation. Those are the sort of things that actually turn up in that. So I suppose one more question to you as mediators in relation to some of those things. If we accept the fact that we don't have the right, or that it's not necessarily appropriate to push people into talking about sustainability if it's not what they're already concerned with, are there situations, are there contexts that you've been in when things relating to that have been intricately part of what you've been dealing with within mediation? And if so, how have you dealt with it? So if any of those development goals, which also include respect for workplace environments, so come on.
Try to see this, not from the transformational point of view, but from how mediation can help create this groundwork for a sustainable development for the region or for the country, right? It's not a mediator being transformative in itself, but just creating the circumstances that are appropriate for the country, for the parties, for the companies to reach these sustainability goals it's just a broader, as I mentioned at the beginning, a very broad view of the impact that we as mediators can have in the future, and also the responsibility that we as mediators can have in the future. And that's a provocative question that Isabel has and Nikki has put for us in this conversation, and something, to be honest with you, that I haven't thought of. But I was invited to talk about investor state and government cases, and I've been thinking, this, in a way, they are helping sustainability. I've never really thought about it before, but they are. And the work that we are doing case by case is changing the way things are done in a broader sense. And it's helping finding new ways to settle, to save resources, to find ways to deal with things environmentally correct or environmentally right. And this is case by case. So one mediator, you never really think of this case is going to impact this many issues. But once you're done and when you think back and when Isabel comes and say, have you thought about sustainability? Then you start thinking, maybe yes, we saved so many jobs. We helped the investment to continue. We allowed for the company to continue existing. I've had cases when you have companies that are about to go bankruptcy because of a controversy with the government. And if it wasn't for mediation, they would be bankrupt now and with a lot of people losing their jobs, but they find settlements. So you are helping and creating a broader impact. But I've never really thought of. So that's, what's so provocative of these questions on how we can actually exponentiate, if that's a word, exponentiate this impact that we have as mediators in each one of our cases.